Welcome back. We're here in the Platinum Province of South Africa in the Northwest, and we're discussing how we can integrate African economies and create this whole market of 1 billion people to work together more optimally as the world focuses on Africa. Now, before we took the break, I did allude to the fact that we needed to talk about how much money is being devoted to ensuring that Africa's population is kept healthy. I mean, we're talking here about a large group of people. As you said, it's 1 billion people across Africa, but we're also talking about a continent that has the potential to create 128 million households that will have a discretionary income spend and consumer spending worth over 1.4 million trillion US dollars. So it is a lot of money. Minister, we do know that most African governments do devote substantial amounts to health. The question is it enough? But when will enough be enough? Will it ever get to a stage where we say, finally, we do have amounts that are sufficient to ensure at least the basic needs, health needs of the population are met?
Well, we can never say it's enough because, firstly, many countries have not yet attained the Abuja Declaration. There is a declaration on the continent of Africa about what percentage of the total budget must be spent on health.
Minister, give us that percentage.
It's 15%. And many countries are not yet at that level. But in South Africa, it's not the problem of inadequacy of the budget. It's a problem of inequality and maldistribution. There's very serious maldistribution in this country because of gross inequalities. The World Organization recommends that 5% of the GDP be spent on health. That's a recommendation from the WHO. In South Africa, we're already at 8.5%. We're far exceeded that recommendation of the World Organization. But the health status for the majority is getting poorer and poorer. The reason being that when you divide that 8.5%, that's where the problem lies.
Right.
5% of that is spent on 16% of the population, those who can afford private health care. And the remaining 3.5% is for 84% of the population. That cannot wash, especially in a democracy. So that's why South Africa is presently introducing what we call National Health Insurance, NHI, to try and bring that in. We believe only then will you talk about having adequate money for the healthcare system.
Minister, then my question becomes then, do we need the private sector skills and distribution systems to help in that regard, or does government have the capability to do it?
I know I'm going to have a very serious argument with the private healthcare here. I don't believe private sector can distribute equitably because
Why?
That's the reason. Well, let me be honest with you, what I've said before, that while poor health is not good for business, but excessive business can also be very bad for health. And I think that's what we are faced with here. If you go back to the World Organization, they've identified 3 trends globally, not only in Africa. 3 trends that makes attaining of healthcare impossible or very difficult. The first trend is hospital centrism, where you don't do primary health care, you don't prevent diseases, you don't work in communities, you just wait for people to get sick in hospital and believe you have got all the machines, the doctors, and the medicines to cure them. It's very bad. The second one is fragmentation. The very fragmentation into public and private is not good for healthcare, where those who are rich go to private and those who are very poor go public. That is fragmentation. In South Africa, we know it very well because we come from the era of apartheid, where the fragmentation was on the basis of color. That was abolished by our constitution. But 18 years later, we found that there is still fragmentation on the basis of how much money we have got. That's very bad. The last trend, which I know is very sensitive with business, but unfortunately it's true, I've got to mention it, was identified as uncontrollable commercialism. Because healthcare is not just a commodity. Health is a human right. It's well established in the Charter of Declaration of Human Rights, the World Organization, in our own country, Section 27 of the Constitution. But it's being ignored sometimes because of business interest. So if you don't recognize that health is not just an ordinary commodity, then this problem will never be solved.
Mr. Hamagashi, can business fairly provide healthcare services? Can business be trusted? I think that's the key word, trusted, to provide health services in a fair manner while still remaining sustainable?
As I said in my opening remarks, across Africa, between 50 and 60% of total health expenditure is out of pocket. So the private sector is involved in the provision of healthcare. So it's not a question of whether we are or not, but it's a question of how we should be. And I'm not going to argue about the merits of what has happened in the past. What we need to do is work together to streamline and coordinate our efforts to provide affordable, acceptable, and available healthcare across for the majority of our people. That said,
you're speaking like a politician.
That said, if we look at some of the initiatives that are being put on the table at the moment, the Department of Science and Technology here under Minister Pando announced the initiative around creating an API manufacturing facility here in South Africa, which would complement an NHI system superbly. What we ask as private sector is let's engage in the debate, right, behind closed doors to see how we can assist, right, what role, what contribution, technical support, manufacturing assets, human capacity, etc. We're open and we want to have that debate. Right?
But what is the answer in your view? Is it regulation? Are you saying the regulatory environment is not been sufficient to help companies provide these business services commercially without in any way endangering their sustainability?
I think in South Africa, the MCC maintains the highest standards. In terms of its resourcing, it could be increased to increase the pace.
Sure. But do you want to finish?
Yeah.
Let him just finish.
To increase the pace of bringing new medicines, innovative, new, affordable generic medicines to market. Right?
Well, I'm trying to save him because I can realize he's being modest. He's trying not to offend me. So I want to talk, we are not doing well in the regulatory environment in our country. And
Minister, do you mean politically? Do you mean the political leadership has not created the enabling environment?
It's not political.
What are you saying?
It's technical capacity. So what we are doing because of that, we are abolishing the Medical Control Council. It's being modest. We are abolishing it. It's not very effective. We want to replace it with a bigger, more efficient South African Health Products Regulatory Authority. And as I'm speaking now, the bill is going to Parliament. It's going to be bigger with more involvement of the private sector, more regulation, not only of medicines, but also of equipment and other devices. It's not happening right now in South Africa. In fact, on the continent, we need to strengthen our regulatory authorities because they are all very weak. And so I'm saying it's being modest because he didn't want to offend me. We know that in the inefficiency of our Medical Control Council, we've actually stifled business. So we are accepting that and we'll correct it.
Minister, can I move to Ghana? I think Minister Motsoaledi makes an important statement. It's recognition that, yes, we do have this regulatory environment that we've created and the institutions to go along with them, but it's looking at them honestly and saying, are they working, are they not working? Is part of the answer then strengthening that regulatory oversight, but being wary at the same time, because we do know that over-regulation kills business, because then it introduces another layer to doing business and increasing the costs. Again, coming back to the question of whether business can fairly and sustainably provide these services.
Well, I think the issue really is how much regulation is enough regulation and whether government's proper role is regulator or referee. Because when you're talking about regulating, and it could be any sector, in Ghana, minerals and mining, it could be healthcare, it could be the oil and gas sector, whichever sector you're talking about. Given that the private sector are the investors mainly in business, and governments all over the world have moved away from being state capitalists, And given that you want to create the incentive, but at the same time, you are looking out for the public good. And we also must take into consideration that sometimes the businesses that we are trying to regulate know much more about the industries than we do. And sometimes in the stakeholder conversations, we actually find ourselves putting in place regulation that helps them more than helps the consumer. You've always got to figure out what is the right balance. And I think that from the point of view of the Ghanaian experience, that's the reason why we've been asking ourselves the question, how do we do this in the best way possible? So recently, when we had to begin to put in place our regulatory structures for our new oil and gas sector, for instance, what we wanted to do was to learn from best practice. But best practice, not just to say we're doing what everybody else is doing, but to look at what our circumstances are and how best we can meet our own national aspirations in putting through the Petroleum Revenue Management Bill, the Petroleum Commission, for instance, as the agencies that now will oversee this new sector. I think that generally speaking, irrespective of whatever sector of government you're looking at, it's always about having that dialogue between the public and private sector and taking into consideration from the point of view of the public sector the greater good that you are supposed to be looking out for, and to see how all of those things can be effectively balanced, and the monitoring and evaluation to check to see whether this is happening. Yeah. Because a lot of the times when we pass the laws, sometimes we are of the view that they will enforce themselves. Yeah. It never happens that way.
True. I'm picking up on an underlying message from Minister Tete here. She spoke about the public good, and I'm getting the sense that she's saying the public good can only be protected by the state. Let me come to Minister Davies. Minister, yeah, that's not what you're saying. I picked up public good, and I thought you were saying, you know, the public good can only be provided by the government.
I'm saying that it's the government's primary responsibility to look out for the public good. But the way that the public good is looked after is not just by government, but making sure that there's enough stakeholder. And by stakeholder, I don't just mean the private sector. I mean every interested stakeholder involvement, so that we can do this oversight together. It cannot just be government.
Indeed. Minister David?
Well, I think that we need to not collapse the important distinction between removing red tape and deregulation. And I think sometimes there's an assumption that they mean the same thing. And I don't think
regulation be efficient, Minister?
Well, I think regulation is necessary, and the regulation constantly has to be looked at against the test of whether or not it's achieving the desired results, and whether there's the capacity to deliver the necessary regulation. And I think that is the essential question. And then around that, you may find that there are huge numbers of what we call red tape, which I think are unnecessary duplication of requirements in terms of reporting, unnecessary form filling, unnecessary compliance with various things that don't achieve any results. And if that is the case, we need to remove it. I gave an example yesterday in our domain where we reviewed and substantially restructured the Companies Act in South Africa. It had been in existence since 1973. It had been amended on numerous occasions. There was a high level of requirement, this and that, very specific requirements that were frankly not enforceable. And so I think we've come in with a much simpler model. Starting with registration, starting with requirements, and so on and so forth, and I think that is the name of the game we need to get involved in. But that doesn't mean that we remove a Companies Act, or that we just sit down with the private sector. They moan and groan about something, and we say, okay, fine, we just remove it. I think that's the mantra that we need to avoid.
We have a classic example that was given to us by the CEO of Shoprite, Mr. Whitey Basson. He says for his trucks to take goods from South Africa into a neighboring country, his drivers and the people that he employs have to fill 1,600 forms. And these are companies that go every single day, twice around the circumference of the earth. I mean, we're talking a lot of paperwork here.
Well, I agree that is a serious challenge. I said that we need to address that in the area of trade facilitation. Now, I think those forms, as I was saying earlier on, have got very little to do with tariffs. They've got transport regulations, permits to go here and there. Those are the sort of issues that are involved, and quite a lot of that, I think, has got very little to do with effective regulation. I think Minister Tete used a euphemism on the Togo-Ghana border when she talked about rent seeking. I think people talk about something else when they cross borders. It starts with a C somewhere or B. And I think those are the sort of terms that are used under this rubric of rent seeking. And I really think we've got to crack down on that. I mean, that is a huge part of promoting regionalism and promoting intra-regional trade. So as I said, when we receive complaints or when somebody goes to the press like this, it is those kinds of issues, and it's that we seek together with our partners to try to address. I think in the tripartite there have been some quite good results. For example, on the it's nothing to do with us. It's Zambia and Zimbabwe on the Chirundu border post. They've managed to rationalize a number of procedures and reduce the time it takes to cross that border. That's the sort of work we need to do.
Mm-hmm. Minister Mashakara, you want to come in?
I think regulation is necessary, but it mustn't be over-regulation, because you need to lay the rules of the game, and those rules must be clearly understood by the users or consumers of those rules. But I think in terms of trade facilitation, the problem is that most of the regulations have to be administered manually. We have to, now it's high time we move on e-government, on e-commerce, and really embrace ICT to make sure that our regulations, they don't really hinder the smooth flow of goods and services and people across the borders.
Yeah. Mr. Magashi, you want to come in? I see you nodding your head slightly.
Yeah, I think I'm in violent agreement with Minister Davis. But I think the important thing here is regulation is a way of life. We accept it, right? And responsible regulation. I think the important thing is the internal consistency between regulation, government procurement, because across the continent, government is the biggest consumer, the biggest competitor for resources, etc. So preferential procurement, industrial policy, and regulation, there has to be internal consistency around that so that when we make investments in the billions, the returns are there, because the same people who are consumers or consumers of government are also our shareholders and stuff and expect a return. So it's that three-legged stool, the internal consistency between that three-legged stool, that's important.
Yeah. Let's take the conversation forward. Let's speak about the need for industrialization, because the regulation that we're talking about is an important cog in ensuring that the monies that are generated in Africa are reinvested in Africa, and the resources that we're taking out of Africa come back and are actually processed inside the continent. Minister Tete, let me start with you at the head of the table, because you indeed are our only lady here on the panel today. When you look at the efforts to beneficiate, the efforts to try to make sure that we grow the African manufacturing base from a Ghanaian perspective, and of course working with other trade and industry ministers across the continent, do you see enough policy coordination in ensuring that when we say that the platinum that we make in South Africa must not come back as jewelry, but that jewelry must actually be produced in South Africa, are we creating those structures that enable us to speak at an African level at least to create this environment?
Are we enabling the structures? Is that the question? So far, no, not really.
We're not doing it.
We're not doing it. But I think that there's a greater will to do it now than there was in the past. Now, for example, Ghanaian gold is mined by Anglo Gold Ashanti and brought here to South Africa, and value is added. And it comes back to us in refined gold and in jewelry. I suppose that for as long as the industrial process takes place in Africa, we should be happy that this is going on. But I can tell you that we'd also be quite happy if the refining took place in Ghana, given the amount of gold mining that takes place over there.
No, the question I ask is, cocoa. Why doesn't Ghana have the biggest cocoa producer? It's the third biggest cocoa producer. Why don't we have the biggest chocolate factories situated in Ghana?
But we do have several cocoa processing factories in Ghana that are making intermediate products, food-grade cocoa powders, as well as cocoa butter, cocoa liquor. So the value addition is happening. But the point I wanted to make is that as far as, because the question you asked was, is it happening across the continent? No. Is it happening within the individual nation states? Yes, because within our industrial policy, we consider that that is the best way forward. So in Ghana, we do add value to our cocoa. We do add value to our timber. We are very much in the infant stages of our oil and gas industry. We do have a pharmaceutical industry that is growing. But all of these are very much in the very basic stages of their formation, and they require a lot of government support to be able, either in terms of incentives, in terms of agreements with the companies that are coming to invest, to let them have the kind of stability and long-term view that allows them to make that investment, that would make them decide to put those investments in Ghana. Is it enough just to look for the Ghanaian market? I think the point has been made severally here, that a lot of the things that we produce are not meant for our markets. And that's the reason why we're not doing enough trade with each other. Is there the opportunity for us to do more towards producing consumer goods for our own African markets? I think there is. And that's the opportunity that we need to do more on.
Yeah, indeed, Minister, part of the reason why I'm raising this as a Pan-African question is because we spoke at the beginning about the fact that our markets are small, and on their own, our individual countries do not have the size and scale that's required to ensure a big manufacturing operation, so that this chocolate does not go to, cocoa does not go to Switzerland and then comes back processed for us. Minister Davies, at the Pan-African level, can we do that? Can we create this regulatory environment that enables a company that is producing platinum in Zimbabwe to then process that platinum and sell it around the continent, indeed around the world, so that everybody comes knocking at Zimbabwe's door rather than us importing these things when they are fully made up?
Well, you see, I think the first thing is that we've all said on the panel here that we all need an industrial policy. A few years ago, the advice that came from those that give advice was you don't need an industrial policy. The world has changed. Countries around the world were told, don't worry about that. Manufacturing is if you don't have manufacturing and you've got derivative trading, that's okay. Countries that make those choices, developed countries, I think, are ruined the day when they decided to do that. So I think that what's happening now is that manufacturing is coming back in a big way. And the importance and centrality of manufacturing is recognized. It's the lesson of economic history. No country's moved from being a developing country or an underdeveloped country to a developed country without passing through the stage of adding value to the raw materials that you have in your country. No country's ever done that, and I don't think any country ever will. So I think that's where we are. But I think that where we are in Africa is we're now recognizing we need to cooperate around this. We don't have a huge amount to coordinate because we don't have a huge amount of industrial policies existing right across the African continent. Only a few countries have got anything we can call an industrial policy. But we did, as African ministers of industry, we did say that there are some particular sectors where we need to focus our attention on. And I think the first one was beneficiation, adding value to mineral products. And that, as I said before in another panel, is going to involve us negotiating with the customers who are currently buying primary products. How can they be encouraged to invest in going further up the value stream and buying something more processed from us? And bigger economies like Brazil have negotiated these kinds of arrangements. Some of us are trying to do it as individual countries. We will do it much better collectively as a continent. I think that's the first industry. The second one, which is coming to the chocolate example, is agro-processing. Africa is a continent which is going to be a major food producer. We're producing too many primary products out of the ground and selling these things. I saw an absolute case of alienation on CNN about the cocoa industry. There was a young boy in the Ivory Coast who was cutting cocoa beans open. He didn't know what they were for and had never tasted a chocolate bar. I think that's the kind of alienation we need. We need to break that down. We need to be producing the chocolate in Africa. We can do it. And the third one was the pharmaceutical industry. I think that we manufacture some generics on the African continent. South Africa has got this project now where we're going to manufacture active pharmaceutical ingredients. But we actually need to also develop the research capability around the diseases that are affecting the African continent and where the African continent is particularly affected. I don't think that research is going to come from the multinational pharmaceuticals who are focused on other markets. I think those are the challenges, and those are the three areas that we identified. And now the new emerging issue is the infrastructure development. And that in South Africa we've identified as a major tool of industrial development as well, where engineering industries and so on can emerge. So I think all of this are the broad directions, and then individual countries will have other possibilities and opportunities as well, and maybe some regions will. And I think then out of all of this, we need to cooperate much more effectively, because in some areas at least we'll get more bang for our buck if we act together.
Yeah, and that cooperation has to begin at a political level. Minister Davis, I take those as your final concluding remarks. I want to go through now to all our panelists, and I want your thoughts on how we create this one African market of 1 billion people. Nice rounded numbers. I'll begin with the private sector businessmen.
I think we've got to be talking more across the private public sector and across boundaries. That's the only way you get to. We won't find the solutions in one shot, but we've got to open that dialogue, and we can't stop it.
It's collaboration. Minister Mashagada?
I think what is important is to increase our supply side, our production levels, and make sure that we produce for that market goods that are relevant, that of high quality. So there's need for innovation, more investment in industrialization, so that we are able to reduce imports and be able to consume locally as a region.
Indeed. Thank you. Minister Masoledi?
Yes, I think it's possible to achieve that integration. In health, we have already achieved integration in the fight against diseases. Within SADC, within AU, within the Africa region of the World Organization, we have got a lot of integration. What we did not integrate yet are the tools, the pharmaceuticals, etc., which we are using to fight those diseases. So because we have already integrated the manner in which we fight the diseases, I think it will be the starting point is to make sure that our regulatory authorities are integrated and working together. Because at the moment, that's not happening.
I think we should use the structures we have a lot more effectively to have these conversations about integration. But then we must also realize that we may not likely all proceed at the same time, at the same level of development. But if you have, as is in the case of the tripartite, a coalition of the willing, and you have others that are ready to add on to that, to have this, to make that number happen, we'll probably get there sooner rather than later.
I think the final word I'll take is that it's a coalition of the willing between the government and the private sector. Ministers, lady, our business person, thank you very much indeed for joining us for this debate on the African consumer and the 4 efforts that we need to input, we need to undertake to ensure that we create one African market of 1 billion people with quite a lot of spend. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.